Welcome to Naomi's Feral Stories. Before we begin, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. And if you're new here, subscribe. You don't want to miss what's coming. No. Settle in. Chapter 1. The interviews had been going on since dawn. 17 women. 17 pairs of folded hands and lowered eyes and voices that never went above a careful, practiced murmur. They had all received the same letter, written on the king's black wax seal. The candidate must be gentle in disposition, obedient in conduct, submissive in all matters of palace hierarchy. She must understand her place. The last line had been underlined twice. Lord Fenwick, the king's steward, had read it aloud at the start of the morning like it was scripture, and every woman in that room had nodded at exactly the right moment. They smiled with their teeth and sat with their ankles crossed and answered every question with "Yes, my lord," and "Whatever the king sees fit, my lord," and "I would be honored to serve in whatever capacity." Elara had stopped listening somewhere around the third interview. She was 8 years old, and she was sitting in a high-backed chair that had been placed beside her father's throne specifically for this occasion, which meant she couldn't swing her legs without the wood creaking loud enough for everyone to hear. She'd tried twice already. Lord Fenwick had looked at her both times with that face he made, the tight, bloodless one, and she'd stopped. But her father hadn't even glanced at her. He never did during things like this. He sat in his throne the way he always sat in his throne, like the chair was part of him, like someone had built it specifically around his spine, and he asked his questions and the women answered them, and Elara watched his face and thought, he's not going to pick any of them either. He knew the look. The slight stillness around his jaw that meant he was bored but wasn't going to say so. The way his fingers didn't move at all, not even a twitch. Her father was always still when he was disappointed, and he had been still for 3 months now, since her last nanny had packed her trunk and left without saying goodbye. Marin. Her name had been Marin, and she'd had a soft voice and cold hands, and she'd never, not once, asked Elara what she was thinking. She just told her things. Sit here. Don't touch that. Smile at the Lord. No, not like that, like this. And eventually Elara had started pretending to be asleep before Marin came in the mornings so she wouldn't have to hear it. She didn't miss her. She missed having someone she wanted to talk to. The 14th interview woman was saying something about her experience with noble children in the eastern reaches when Elara slid off her chair. The creak was enormous. Her father's eyes moved to her. Just for a second. Elara. His voice was quiet. It was always quiet. He never needed to raise it. I need water, she said. He looked at her for a moment longer than necessary. Then he looked back at the woman. Fenwick. Have someone bring the princess water. I'll get it myself, she said. I know where the kitchens are. The silence that followed was the specific kind that meant she'd said something wrong without quite understanding what. Lord Fenwick made a small, pained noise. The woman being interviewed kept her smile absolutely fixed, like her face had been nailed there. Her father said nothing, which with him could mean yes or no or do what you want. I'm tired of looking at you. Elara had spent years trying to tell them apart, and she still couldn't always manage it. She slipped out of the hall before anyone decided to stop her. The kitchen courtyard was loud in a way the rest of the palace never was. There was banging, someone working a pot against the stone basin. There was the smell of something burnt and something else trying to cover it. And there were voices, 2 of them both going at the same time the way voices do when neither person plans to stop first. Elara came around the corner of the herb garden wall and stopped. One of the voices belonged to the head cook, Master Aldrich. She knew him, enormous man, red face, the kind of mustache that moved when he was angry, which was most of the time. He was angry now. He had a wooden spoon pointed at the other person like it was a weapon. The other person was a girl. Not a woman, or maybe she was, it was hard to tell. She was maybe 17, 18 at most, with her sleeves rolled to the elbows and her dark hair half escaped from its knot and flower on one side of her face. She didn't look frightened of the spoon. She had her arms crossed and she was looking at Aldrich the way you look at someone who is saying something extremely stupid and you're trying to decide if they know it yet. And I'm telling you, Aldrich was saying, jabbing the spoon. Bet sets the bread at 4th bell because that's when she was told to set the bread, and if it comes out wrong it's because the stone oven's been running cold on the left side for 3 weeks and no one's fixed it, not because she can't. Then dock my wages, the girl said. Flat. Come. Like it was obvious. If someone has to take the hit for it, dock mine. I'm not standing here watching you write her up for something that isn't her fault. Aldrich stared at her. You don't have wages worth docking, girl. Then dock next month's. She uncrossed her arms. Either way, leave Bet alone. Aldrich looked like he was trying to decide between firing her on the spot and dying of shock. He pointed the spoon at her again, made a noise that wasn't quite a word, and then turned and went back inside. The girl watched him go. Then she let out a long breath and pressed the heel of her hand against her forehead and said quietly to no one in particular, "That man." Elara stepped out from behind the herb wall. The girl heard her, turned and looked at her. Not at her dress. Not at the small silver circlet her father insisted she wear outside her rooms. At her face, the way most adults never quite managed. She didn't bow. She tilted her head. You look bored, she said. Elara blinked. I am bored. Were you watching that whole time? Almost. Elara came a few steps closer. What's Bet? Who's Bet? She's one of the junior bred girls. Aldrich's been trying to blame her for the oven problem for a week. The girl looked at her steadily. You're the princess. Yes. Right. She didn't seem particularly moved by this. She picked up the cloth she'd set down on the well edge and started wiping her hands. Well, he's not going to actually do anything. He never does. He just likes to feel like he's about to. Elara thought about her father's interviews. The women with their careful smiles. The way none of them had looked at her like she was a person. Want to help me win this argument? The girl had said. Like it was the most normal thing. Like she was just asking. Elara stared at her. What's your name? The girl glanced up. Zoe. How do you know it'll work? Offering your wages. Zoe shrugged. Because he doesn't actually want money. He wants to feel like he won. So I gave him something to take that wasn't Bet. She folded the cloth. And if he does take it, fine. She's worth it. Elara had never heard a servant talk about another servant like that. Like they were worth something. Like the math was simple. I'm supposed to be getting interviewed, Elara said. For a nanny. Zoe looked at her. And you're here instead. None of them are right. What's wrong with them? Elara thought about it. They all answer questions the same way. Like they already know what answer my father wants before he even finishes asking. She paused. You don't do that. Zoe was quiet for a second. Then she said, No. I don't. They stood there in the kitchen courtyard with the smell of something burnt still threading through the air, and Elara thought, this is the first real conversation I've had in 3 months. She turned and went back toward the interview hall. When she walked in, her father was mid-sentence with candidate 15. Lord Fenwick was writing something. The woman was smiling. Elara walked to her chair, climbed back into it and waited. When candidate 15 was done, her father looked at her. Well, I want the girl from the kitchen courtyard, Elara said. Zoe. The silence this time was different. Longer. Colder. The kitchen staff are not, Fenwick started. Zoe, Elara said again. She folded her hands in her lap exactly the way all 17 women had folded theirs, because she knew what she was doing. I won't eat until you say yes. Her father looked at her for a very long time. His fingers on the arm of his throne didn't move at all. Tap-to-do. Lord Fenwick delivered the news himself. He came to the kitchen at 1:30 the evening bell, when the last of the supper pots were still warm and the junior staff were scrubbing the long stone table in the back. Zoe was on her knees under the bread shelf fixing a loose bracket that had been wobbling for 2 weeks and nobody else had bothered with, and she heard his footsteps before she saw him. The particular click of court shoes on kitchen flagstone, too clean, too deliberate. She backed out from under the shelf. Stood up. Fenwick looked at her the way people look at a stray that's wandered into somewhere it doesn't belong. He had a scroll in his hand already open, which meant he'd rehearsed this. You are to report to the east wing at first bell, he said. Princess Elara's rooms. You will be fitted for appropriate attire this evening. The king has agreed to a probationary arrangement of, and I want to be very clear about the word probationary. How long? Zoe asked. He blinked. I beg your pardon? The probation. How long is it? Fenwick's mouth did something complicated. 30 days. At the end of which the king will assess whether. Fine. She picked up the bracket tool and set it on the shelf. Is there anything else? He stared at her for a full 3 seconds. Then he rolled the scroll back up with the precise movements of a man holding himself very carefully together. You will be expected, he said slowly, to conduct yourself with the decorum appropriate to your new station. The king has very specific. Lord Fenwick. Zoe looked at him. Not unkindly. I'll be there at first bell. He left. She watched him go. Bet, across the room, had stopped scrubbing and was staring at her with wide eyes. Zoe, Bet said. That's the king's daughter. I know. You don't, I mean, she set down her cloth. Do you understand what happens if the king decides he doesn't like you? Zoe looked at the loose bracket she'd fixed. Then she looked at Bet. Do you understand what happens if I say no and go back to the bread ovens while some woman who smiles at the right moment spends the next 10 years teaching that child how to make herself small? Bet had no answer for that. Neither did Zoe really. It wasn't courage exactly. It was just that some things were wrong in a way that made the risk feel simple. She'd been in the East Wing exactly twice in her 3 years at the palace. Once by accident, once to deliver a message for Aldrich that he'd been too proud to deliver himself. She remembered the quiet of it, the way sound stopped at the archway like it had been told to, the thick rugs that swallowed footsteps, the tapestries that were so old the colors had gone soft. The guard at the archway looked at her fitted gray uniform, new, still a little stiff at the collar, and then at her face and then stepped aside without a word. Elara was awake. Of course she was awake. She was sitting cross-legged on her enormous bed with a book open in her lap that she was clearly not reading. And when Zoe came through the door she looked up with an expression that was trying very hard to be casual and failing completely. You came, Elara said. I said I would. Zoe looked around the room. It was large and cold despite the fire and full of beautiful things that all seemed to be just slightly out of a child's reach. The shelves too high, the chairs too formal, the writing desk too polished to actually work at. Have you eaten? They brought supper. That's not what I asked. Elara blinked. Then slowly she said, some of it. Zoe crossed the room, looked at the tray on the side table. The bread was untouched. The meat had been moved around. The fruit was mostly gone, which tracked. Children would always eat fruit if they could and avoid everything else. Bread first, Zoe said. Then we can talk. You sound like Marin. Who's Marin? My last nanny. She was always telling me what to eat. I'm not telling you what to eat. Zoe pulled the chair from the writing desk over to the fire, sat down and picked up the other half of the bread herself. I'm eating bread in front of you and hoping you feel left out. There was a pause. Then Elara uncurled herself from the bed, padded over and sat on the hearth rug. She picked up the remaining bread. They ate in silence for a moment. The fire popped. Outside, somewhere far across the palace grounds, a night bird called once and then stopped. My father doesn't want you here, Elara said, not accusatory, just factual, the way children are when they've been listening at the right doors. I know. He thinks you're going to be a problem. Zoe looked at her. Am I wrong to think you find that a little funny? Elara's mouth curved. Not a palace smile. A real one, quick and crooked and a little guilty. Maybe a little. She met him the next morning. Not by design. She was coming down the main corridor of the East Wing with Elara's breakfast tray. She'd gone to collect it herself because the girl who'd been assigned to bring it had the sniffles and Zoe hadn't wanted Elara waiting. And he came around the corner from the opposite direction and they both stopped. Alpha King Caelan was not what she'd expected, and she'd expected quite a lot. She'd heard the words people used for him in the kitchens, when they thought no one careful was listening. Ruthless. They said that won the most. And from one of the older laundresses who'd been at the palace for 30 years. He was different before the queen died. Said like an epitaph. He was taller than she'd pictured. Dark hair, not groomed, just pushed back like he'd done it himself without a mirror. He was in plain clothes, no crown, which threw her for a moment. The only things that marked him as king were the way he held himself and the way the corridor seemed to reorganize itself around him, space deforming slightly like it knew better. His eyes moved from her face to the tray to her uniform to her face again. She did not bow. It wasn't defiance, not exactly. It was just that her hands were full of a breakfast tray and she needed both of them to hold it level. And by the time the calculation had run its course in her head, the moment had passed. Or that's what she told herself later. His eyes went very still. "You're the kitchen girl," he said. "Zoe." She said it before she thought about it. Just her name offered back. Not "Yes, Your Majesty" or "I am my king." Just her name. The silence stretched. She was aware, with specific and uncomfortable clarity, that this was the man who had underlined submissive twice in a letter and sent it to 17 women. That Fenwick scroll had included, in the fine print she'd skimmed last night, a list of expected behaviors that started with "will address the king only when addressed" and ended with something about physical posturing. She was holding a breakfast tray with both hands, standing in a corridor, looking at the Alpha King directly in the face. One of his brows moved. Just slightly. "You're taking Elara her breakfast." She was going to wait. Zoe kept her voice even. "The assigned girl is ill. There are other girls." "Yes." "I was faster." Something crossed his face, gone too quick to name. He looked at the tray. Then back at her. "She ate yesterday evening?" The question surprised her. Not the words. The texture of them. Not did she cause any problems or did she behave. He'd asked if she ate. "Some," Zoe said. "Bread and fruit. I'll have better luck this morning." Another silence. It had a different quality than the first one. Less like assessment, more like something he hadn't decided yet. "Fenwick tells me you interrupted his delivery of the appointment terms." "I asked how long the probation was." "That's an interruption." "It's a question." She paused. "Your Majesty." His jaw moved. Not quite a clench. More like something settling. He looked at her for a long moment and she looked back because she didn't know how to do anything else. And the corridor was very quiet, and she was aware of the warmth of the tray under her hands and the fact that her heart was doing something irregular that she was choosing not to examine. 30 days, he said at last. Like a reminder. Like a warning dressed as information. "I'll be here in 31, she said. She didn't know why she said it. She walked around him before she could find out, and she did not look back, and she absolutely did not hear whether the breath he let out behind her was quiet or not. She found Elara sitting in the window seat with her chin on her knees, watching the training yard below. "What are they doing?" Zoe set the tray on the low table and came to look. The king's warriors were running a drill she didn't know the name of. Formations, breaking, reforming. All of them enormous. All of them moving like violence had been made into a language they'd been speaking since birth. "Training," Elara said. "They do it every morning." Pause. "My father watches sometimes. From that window." She pointed to a window 2 floors up across the inner court. "He thinks I don't know." Zoe looked at the window. Then at the girl. "What else does he think you don't know?" Elara turned from the glass. She had old eyes for 8. Not sad exactly, just worn in specific places where they should still have been smooth. "That he comes to stand outside my door sometimes at night," she said. "He never comes in. But I can hear him." Zoe was quiet. "He doesn't know what to do with me," Elara said. Plain. No self-pity in it. "He knew what to do with my mother, I think. He was like him. But I'm not like him." "What are you like?" Elara thought about it. Really thought. The way she'd thought in the kitchen courtyard when Zoe had asked her what was wrong with the other women. "I'm loud in my head," she finally said. "And he's quiet in his." Zoe looked at the girl. Then she looked at the window 2 floors up. Then she started unpacking the breakfast tray. Loud in his head too, she thought. Just in a way he's built walls around. She didn't say it. Not yet. Chapter 3. The first time was an accident. Day 6 of the 30. Zoe had taken Elara down to the lower library, not the grand one on the 2nd floor with the velvet ropes and the books no one was allowed to touch, but the small one behind the servants' stair that smelled like dust and old candle wax and had a window seat wide enough to lie down in. Elara had been delighted in the specific way of a child discovering something that was already theirs but no one had told them about. They were in the middle of an argument about whether the dragon in the story Zoe was reading aloud was actually a villain or just an animal acting like an animal when the door opened. Caelan stopped in the doorway. He had a document in his hand. He looked at the room, at Elara on the window seat with her socks off and her feet tucked up, at Zoe cross-legged on the floor with the book, at the general atmosphere of a space that had, in the span of 6 days, stopped looking like a room and started looking like a place 2 people actually used. "Elara," he said. "Father." She didn't scramble upright. She turned to look at him with the calm of someone who had decided, privately, that they were done performing. Something Zoe had noticed she'd been practicing. "We're reading." His eyes moved to Zoe. She looked back at him. She had the book open on her lap and she didn't close it, because closing it would have been a kind of apology and she hadn't done anything that needed apologizing for. "The lower library," he said. "Not a question." "Elara found it," Zoe said. "Yesterday. She's been through most of the east shelf." Something moved in his face. He looked at his daughter. Really looked the way Zoe had noticed he sometimes almost did and then stopped himself like looking too long cost him something he wasn't sure he had enough of. "You've been reading." "Zoe reads to me," Elara said. "But I read the titles myself. And some of the shorter ones. There's one about the northern campaigns with maps in it. I wanted to show you but you were in council all morning." The hand holding the document dropped slightly. Just an inch. "The northern campaigns. With maps." Elara unfolded herself and slid off the window seat. She padded to the shelf in her socked feet and pulled out a battered volume with a cracked spine. She held it up. "Zoe says the eastern flank strategy was stupid and the general deserved to lose." Caelan looked at Zoe. "I said it was overcomplicated," Zoe said. "Which it was." He split his line in mud season. Another silence. A different one from all the others. This one had something surprised at the bottom of it. "He did," Caelan said slowly like he hadn't meant to say it. Elara looked between them. "You can sit if you want," she told her father. "Generous. Magnanimous. The way children are when they're offering something they have decided is theirs to offer." Caelan looked at the window seat. Then at the document in his hand. Then at the window seat again. He stayed 12 more minutes. Zoe kept reading. He didn't sit. He stood near the door with his arms crossed, which she understood as the closest he knew how to get to yes when he'd already told himself no. But he stayed. And when Elara asked him a question about the Northern River geography he answered it. And the answer went on longer than he'd probably planned. When he left he didn't say goodbye. He just went. Elara watched the door close. Then she looked at Zoe with an expression that was working very hard not to be too pleased with itself. "He stayed," she said. "He did," Zoe agreed. She looked back down at the book and did not think about the way his voice had changed when he talked about the river geography. Lower. Less controlled. The voice of someone saying something they actually knew rather than something they'd decided to say. He did not think about it at all. The second time was not an accident. Day 11. Zoe was crossing the upper courtyard with a basket of Elara's mended things when she heard the shouting. Not loud, muffled behind the council room doors, but she'd grown up in crowded quarters where sound carried through walls like it had somewhere to be and she could pick out texture. This was the kind of shouting that was one person and a room full of silence, which was the worst kind. He kept walking. It was not her business. She had a basket and a list of the day's tasks in 30 days that had become 23 and she had no intention of. The door opened. Lord Aldrich of the Western Reaches came out first, red-faced, and then 2 lesser lords she didn't know by name and then Fenwick and then no one, and then the doors stayed open because no one had thought to close them, and Caelan was standing at the head of the council table with both hands flat on the wood and his head down. She should have walked past. She was 2 feet from the corridor that turned left toward the east wing. She stopped. He hadn't seen her. The room was half in shadow, the morning light coming from the wrong angle, and she was standing in it from the outside where the courtyard was bright. She could have left. She watched him put both hands over his face. Not dramatically, just pressing his palms against his eyes for 3 seconds, like a man trying to hold something in that was determined to get out. Then he dropped them, straightened, reached for the nearest document and stood there reading it without reading it. Zoe set her basket down on the courtyard flags. She walked to the council room door, knocked on the open frame. He turned. The expression he'd had a moment ago was gone, completely gone, replaced by the usual, and she'd seen enough faces in her life to know how much work that took. "What are you doing here?" "I was passing." He came inside 2 steps. "What did Lord Aldrich want?" His face did something careful. "That is not. You don't have to tell me. I'm asking if you want to say it out loud to someone who doesn't have a stake in it." She kept her voice even. "Sometimes that helps." The silence this time was long. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read, which was unusual. She could read most people, and she waited because she'd learned that some silences needed to be let alone to decide what they were. "He wants me to sign a trade compact that routes the southern grain supply through his territory," Caelan said at last. "And he'll pull his warriors from the border garrison if I don't." "Can he do that?" "Legally? Yes." "Would he?" Something shifted. "Probably not. The garrison protects his own lands. But the threat is the point." Zoe thought about it. "So he needs to feel like he won something." Caelan looked at her. "Give him something small," she said. "Something that looks like a concession but doesn't move the actual weight. He wants to go home feeling like he got something." She paused. Men like that usually do. The quiet that followed had a strange texture to it. He was looking at her the way he'd looked at her in the corridor on the first morning. That same not-quite assessment, something underneath it she couldn't put a name to. "You're talking about the Alpha King's border politics," he said. "You asked for someone who'd say it out loud." "I didn't ask." "No. But you didn't close the door either." He held her gaze. She held his. The council room was very still around them. All the lords gone, the long table empty, morning dust drifting in the window light. She was a servant girl with a basket of mended clothes in the courtyard outside. He was a king. And neither of them looked away. "Lord Aldrich," he said finally, "has a younger son he's trying to place in a good position." Zoe nodded slowly. "There it is." "There it is," he repeated, almost to himself. She picked up her basket from where she'd left it outside the door. "Elara wants to show you the maps again this evening," she said. "If you have time." She didn't wait for an answer. She had found that not waiting for his answers made the answers when they came more honest. He came to the library at 7th bell. Elara was already asleep. She'd faded mid-sentence over a book about ocean currents, which Zoe found more interesting than the child did, and had been reading quietly in the fire glow while Elara's breathing went slow and even. She heard his footstep in the hall. She knew it by now. 3 days in she'd started cataloging the sounds of the palace the way she'd cataloged the sounds of the kitchen, and his step had a specific weight to it, deliberate without being heavy. He stopped in the doorway. "Elara." "The fire." "Zoe." "She wanted to show you the maps," Zoe said quietly so as not to wake her. She fell asleep waiting. He didn't answer. He was looking at his daughter with that expression again, the one that cost him something. His jaw was set but his eyes weren't. Eyes were always the harder thing to control in her experience. She'd seen it in the kitchen too, in people who wanted to seem harder than they were. The jaw was easy. The eyes gave everything away. "She read 4 chapters today by herself," Zoe said. "Ocean currents. She kept asking me why the water moves when there's no wind, and I told her I didn't actually know, and she thought that was very funny." He looked at her then. "Across the sleeping child, across the firelight. You told her you didn't know." "Because I didn't. The nannies before you were expected to have answers. They probably made some up then." She looked at Elara. "She's smart enough to check. Better she knows I'm honest now." Something moved through his face. Complicated, layered, gone before she could follow it all the way down. He stepped into the room. He didn't take a chair. He crouched beside the window seat where Elara slept, and he looked at her for a moment, and then he did something Zoe hadn't expected. He pulled the blanket up over her shoulder. Carefully. Two-handed and careful, like he was afraid of getting it wrong. Zoe watched him. He straightened. When he turned, he caught her watching, and for a moment neither of them was performing anything. He wasn't the king, she wasn't the servant, and the fire was the only sound in the room, and the space between them, maybe 6 feet not more, felt both very large and very insufficient. She looked away first. This time. "Good night, your majesty," she said to the fire. He stood there for another moment. "Caelan," he said. She looked up. "By name," he said. "When there's no one else here." He said it like a man leaving something on a table and walking away before he had to watch what happened to it. He left. She sat with the fire and her heartbeat and the sleeping child and the name, which she didn't say out loud, but which sat in her chest for the rest of the night like an ember that didn't know it was supposed to go out. Chapter 4. It started with Lady Vessa. She was the oldest of the court women, not in age but in tenure, 30 years of watching kings make decisions and knowing before they did which ones would cost them. She had a sharp face and a sharper memory, and she'd outlasted 3 wars and 2 succession crises by understanding one thing with absolute clarity. Power moved like water, and you either learned the shape of the channels or you drowned in them. She noticed on day 14. She'd come to the East Wing to deliver a formal invitation to Elara for the winter solstice feast, a task that was, strictly speaking, beneath her, but Lady Vessa had not survived 30 years by doing only the tasks that weren't beneath her. She'd arrived at the library because Fenwick had told her that was where the princess spent her mornings now, and she'd stood in the doorway for a moment before either of them saw her. The girl, the servant, was teaching Elara to play stones. Not the court version with its ivory pieces and formal rules, but the street version, the one played with actual stones on actual dirt, which meant they were on the floor with a square scratched into the back of a piece of old parchment, and Elara was losing badly and laughing about it. Vessa had watched long enough to see the servant girl glance up when Elara's laughter got loud enough to make her worry about something. Not the noise, not the impropriety, the sound of a child who was genuinely, uncalculatedly happy in a room that had not heard that sound in 3 years. She'd delivered the invitation and left without saying what she'd seen. But she'd seen it. And Lady Vessa, above all things, kept excellent accounts. The whispers started on day 17. Zoe heard them the way she always heard things, not directly but through the shape of what people did when they thought she wasn't listening. The way conversation changed register when she passed through the main hall. The way 2 of the senior ladies stopped walking when she came around a corner and then resumed when she'd gone by. The way Fenwick looked at her now, not with the original bloodless assessment, but with something that had more planning in it. She knew what the whispers were about. She wasn't foolish. He'd passed her in the corridor 3 times in one day on day 15, which was once more than made sense for a king with a full schedule, and she'd known it and he'd known it, and neither of them had said anything about it. He'd started leaving the council room door open when he worked in the evenings. She wasn't sure he knew he was doing that either. She was scrubbing Elara's good boots. The child had found a mud puddle with the dedication of someone conducting a scientific experiment, when Fenwick came in and closed the door behind him. She kept scrubbing. "The king," Fenwick said, "is being watched. He's always being watched. He's a king. Don't be clever with me." He sat down, which surprised her. He never sat in rooms he considered below him. Lady Vessa has had 2 private conversations with Lord Aldrich since his visit. A 3rd is scheduled for tomorrow morning. Zoe set the boot down. "About what?" "About the question," Fenwick said, "of whether the king is forming an inappropriate attachment to a servant who was installed over his objection by an 8-year-old child." The fire crackled. Somewhere in the East Wing a door closed. "And what do they plan to do about this question?" Zoe said, keeping her voice even. "Raise it. Formally. At the solstice feast." Fenwick looked at her with an expression she had not seen from him before. Not warmth, not exactly, but something adjacent to honesty. "Aldrich wants leverage. Vessa wants the old order back. If they can present the court with a story, a king distracted by a common girl, his judgment compromised, they can pressure him into decisions he otherwise wouldn't make." Zoe was quiet. "You should leave," Fenwick said. "The 30 days end in 13. I can arrange it so you're transferred quietly. Back to the kitchens or another household entirely." The princess will be unhappy for a while. He paused. It would be better than what happens if this goes further. She looked at him. For who? For him. Fenwick said it simply. Like it cost him something. He has ruled this kingdom for 7 years on the foundation of being unmovable. Whatever has happened in the last 17 days, if it becomes a story the court tells, it becomes a weapon. And he has enough enemies who know how to use weapons. The silence sat between them. I'll think about it, she said. Fenwick nodded once and left. She picked up the boot. She scrubbed it. Outside, the training yard was quiet because the morning drill had ended, and the upper courtyard was quiet, and the whole east wing was quiet except for the sound of Elara somewhere down the hall singing something off-key to herself the way she'd started doing in the last 2 weeks. Unself-consciously, without permission, just because she felt like it. Zoe stared at the boot and thought about leaving. She had mostly decided. She would finish the 30 days, she wasn't going to run, that wasn't in her. And then she would tell Elara the truth, which was that she wasn't going anywhere permanently, just somewhere else in the palace, and they could still read together sometimes. And she was working through the exact words when she rounded the corner of the inner corridor and walked directly into Caelan. Not near him. Into him. She was looking at the floor and he was coming from the opposite direction, and she hit his chest with enough force that she stumbled back, and his hand came out and caught her arm before she went down. Just caught her. Automatic. His grip was warm through her sleeve, and he didn't let go immediately the way someone should, the way someone who was thinking about what they were doing would. She looked up. He was looking down. The corridor was empty. Evening bell had just rung and the East Wing staff had finished their rounds, and there was no one, not one person, and the torch on the wall threw unsteady light that made everything feel less real than it was, which was the wrong condition for Zoe's currently compromised decision-making. His hand was still on her arm. I heard what Fenwick told you, he said. She stilled. You. He told me he was going to speak to you. I didn't know what he planned to say. His jaw moved. I should have spoken to you myself. It's fine, she said. He's right. She stopped. Tried again. Fenwick's right about the optics. I'll finish the 30 days and I extended the probation. She blinked. What? This morning. I told Fenwick the assessment would be ongoing. His voice was even, but there was something underneath it that wasn't. I should have told you directly. That was... He stopped. A muscle in his jaw moved. I'm not accustomed to explaining my decisions. You don't have to explain them. I know I don't have to. He said it quietly. Just that. The torch flickered. His hand was still on her arm and they were close, closer than they'd ever stood, because she'd walked into him and neither of them had fixed that yet, and she could see the specific tired lines around his eyes that she'd catalogued over 17 days of watching a man hold too much and let no one see the weight of it. Fenwick's afraid, she said. And I think Lady Vess is too. Not of me, of what happens if you let something matter. He looked at her. And what is it that matters? He should have said Elara. That would have been safe. That would have been true enough and careful enough, and she could have said it and stepped back, and that would have been that. You know what matters, she said instead. The silence between them was so full it had almost a physical shape. She could feel it the way you feel a change in pressure before a storm, that tightening in the air. He was very still and she was very still, and the torch made shadows of them both against the stone wall. And his hand on her arm had shifted in some subtle way that wasn't pulling her closer but wasn't releasing her either, just holding. Like he was making a decision about what his hands were allowed to do. His head bent toward hers. Not all the way, not even most of the way, but enough that she felt the change in distance, like a shift in temperature, the warmth of him reaching her before he did, and she was aware of her own breath, the specific fact of it, the way it had become a thing she was suddenly managing consciously. Zoe. He said her name the way she'd said his, that night in the library, left on a surface, the speaker already halfway gone. And then the door at the end of the corridor opened. Elara, in her nightgown, sleep-rumpled and confused, holding a candle she'd clearly lit herself. Zoe? I had a bad dream and you weren't. She stopped. Looked at them. Tilted her head the way she did when she was cataloging something. Father. Caelan released her arm. He stepped back in the same motion. Smooth, practiced, the composure of a man who had spent years making transitions look like nothing. Go back to bed, he said to Elara. His voice was even. Zoe will come. Elara looked at Zoe. Zoe looked at Elara. Something passed between them that wasn't quite a conversation. Okay, Elara said. She turned and padded back the way she'd come, and the door clicked behind her and the corridor was empty again. Caelan looked at the floor. Then at the wall. Then with the deliberate effort of a man doing something that didn't come easily at her. The solstice feast is in 4 days, he said. Aldrich and Vesa will be there. I know. If they raise it formally, I will need to respond formally. He paused. Whatever I say will be public. It will become the story the court tells. Yes. I need you to understand that. I understand it. He looked at her for a long moment. Something crossed his face. She caught the edge of it before it settled. Something that looked briefly like fear. Not of Aldrich or Vesa. Of something smaller and closer and harder to defend against. Go to Elara, he said. She went. She did not look back this time either. But she heard him stand in the corridor long after she'd gone, and she understood, in the way she understood most things, through the texture of what was happening rather than what was being said, that he was standing there deciding what kind of man he was going to be in 4 days. She hoped quietly that he'd choose right. She was not entirely sure he would. Chapter 5. The solstice feast smelled like pine resin and beeswax and the particular anxiety of a room full of people who had all come to watch the same thing happen and were pretending they hadn't. Zoe stood at the far end of the great hall in the place servants stood during feast nights. Along the stone wall, near enough to be useful, far enough to be furniture. She had not been asked to attend. She had come because Elara had said at breakfast, in the careful voice of a child trying not to ask for something too directly, I always find feast nights hard. The room is very loud and father has to be very formal. And then she'd looked at the window. Zoe had come. The hall was full. Lords and ladies from 6 territories, their retinues fanned out behind them, everyone in their winter colors, deep red, dark green, the heavy gold of the western houses. Caelan was at the high table already seated, and she could see him from where she stood. Straight-backed and still and wearing the crown for the first time since she'd arrived, which changed something about his face in a way she hadn't expected. Made him look further away. Elara was beside him in a green dress she'd complained about for 20 minutes that morning because the collar was itchy. She was being very good, sitting straight, smiling at the right moments. She found Zoe across the hall and her eyes said, I see you. Zoe gave her the smallest nod. I'm here. Lady Vesa was 3 seats from the king's right. Lord Aldrich was across the table. They had not looked at each other once since the feast began, which meant they had already said everything they needed to say before it started. Zoe watched. She ate nothing. She watched. It happened between the 2nd and 3rd courses. Lord Aldrich rose. He had a cup in his hand and a speech prepared. She could tell by the way he'd straightened his jacket twice. And the hall quieted the way halls do when someone powerful stands up with intent. A toast, Aldrich said. To the king's wisdom. Which has guided this kingdom through 7 years of, and then he paused and the pause was the whole point, considerable challenge, and which we trust will continue to guide him. In all matters. He looked at Zoe when he said all matters. Not long. Not obviously. Just enough. Half the room understood. The other half would be told later. Caelan did not move. Vesa raised her cup without smiling. Several lords followed. The toast finished, Aldrich sat and the hall filled back up with conversation, but the thing had been said. It was in the room now. It would not leave. Zoe looked at Caelan. He was looking at the table. His hand was flat on the wood. She knew that hand now. She'd watched it for 17 days, the way it went still when he was deciding something. The way stillness with him was never emptiness, always wait. He looked up. Across the hall. At her. Her breath did the thing it did now, the thing she'd stopped pretending wasn't happening. He looked at her for a long moment. Long enough that the people near him would notice. Long enough that it was not an accident. Then he looked at Aldrich. High Lord, Caelan said. Quiet the way he always said things. The hall didn't go silent. It tapered, Conversation folding inward table by table until the quiet reached the walls. He didn't raise his voice. He never needed to. I want to address something directly. Aldrich went very still. This was not, Zoe suspected, what he had planned. There has been, Caelan said, some conversation among the court regarding my daughter's household arrangements. He paused. Specifically, regarding the woman who currently serves as her companion and nanny. No one breathed. I am aware, he continued, that her appointment was irregular. That she was not among the candidates presented. That she does not come from a noble house or a courtly tradition, or any of the expected backgrounds. He reached for his cup. Set it down without drinking. I am also aware that under her care my daughter has learned to read 3 new chapters weekly, ask questions I cannot always answer, and laugh without checking first to see if she's allowed. The hall was absolutely silent now. Elara, at his right, had gone very still in the way of someone trying not to cry and not quite winning. These are not small things, Caelan said. He said it plainly. Not like a speech, like a fact being established. A court runs on tradition and hierarchy, and there is wisdom in that. I have governed by it for 7 years. He let a breath out. But my daughter is 8 years old and she chose someone good. And I find that I am not willing to undo that choice because it makes certain members of this court uncomfortable. Aldrich opened his mouth. Lord Aldrich. Caelan looked at him. Just looked. I am not finished. Aldrich closed his mouth. If there are concerns about this kingdom's governance or my judgment, I welcome them through the appropriate channels. If there are concerns about trade compacts and garrison commitments, my steward will arrange the conversations. He looked slowly around the table. What I will not do is have the character of a woman who has done nothing wrong debated at my feast table as a means of moving other pieces on other boards. Are we clear? It was not phrased as a question. The silence stretched for 3 full seconds. Then Vesa, who had survived 30 years by knowing exactly when the water had found a new channel, raised her cup again. Quite clear, Your Majesty, she said. And she actually smiled. Small, sharp, approving in a way that said, I was waiting to see which way you'd fall. Aldrich, who had not survived 30 years of anything, looked at the table. The feast resumed. Zoe found that she needed to be outside. She slipped through the side passage behind the hall, the narrow one the servers used, and came out into the small courtyard behind the kitchens. It was cold. The kind of cold that had teeth midwinter, stars so clear and numerous it almost looked like something had been spilled. She stood in it and breathed and tried to put herself back into the right order. He had said it in front of everyone. My daughter chose someone good. Said it and looked at Aldrich and meant every syllable of it as the thing it was. Not a declaration, not a romantic speech, just a king telling his court this person matters and I will not let you use her. That was, she pressed her hands together. That was. She heard him before she saw him. His step on the courtyard stone. She turned. He'd taken the crown off. She didn't know when. Sometime between the table and here. He was holding it in one hand loosely like he'd forgotten it was there, and he looked like himself again, the version she knew, the one who stood near doorways and watched his daughter sleep and left his name on tables and walked away. He stopped a few feet from her. The stars were very bright. The courtyard was very empty. You should go back, she said. They'll notice you're gone. They'll notice, he agreed. He didn't move. She looked at the crown in his hand. Is that comfortable to wear? He looked at it too. No. Does anything about this life feel comfortable to you? He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, the library. These last 17 days. He paused. You. She looked at him. He looked at her. The cold air moved between them and it had no opinion and the stars had no opinion, and there was no one here to make the moment mean something political or dangerous or wrong. I'm a kitchen girl, she said. Not a protest, just the truth laid out. I argue with head cooks. I don't bow when I'm supposed to. I'm going to keep doing both those things because I don't know how to do anything else. I know, he said. Your court. My court, he said quietly, can learn to accommodate. He took one step toward her and stopped. Like he was giving her the distance. Like whatever happened next was hers to decide. I am aware that I am not easy. I don't say the right things in the right order. I stand near doors when I should sit down and I make people wait for answers I'm still working out and I am. He stopped. His jaw moved. I am told I am difficult to love. She held very still. Who told you that? My wife. He said it simply. Before she died. I don't think she meant it cruelly. I think she was just tired. He looked at the crown in his hand. She was not wrong. Zoe took a step toward him. She didn't plan it. Her feet just made the decision and the rest of her followed, and then she was closer than the corridor, the torchlight gone, just starlight and cold and the two of them, and she reached out and took the crown from his hand. He let her. He watched her as she turned it over once, looking at it, and set it on the stone ledge beside them like it was a pair of someone's boots. You stand near doors, she said, because you want to be in the room but you don't trust yourself to stay if you sit down. You wait before you answer because you're actually thinking, which most people don't bother to do. And you came outside in the middle of your own feast in the middle of winter and you're not wearing a cloak. She looked at him. You are difficult. You're not difficult to love. The last word landed between them and she felt at the same time he did. She could tell by the way something shifted in his face, something that had been wound very tight for a very long time, loosening by degrees. He raised his hand slowly. The way you move around something you're afraid of startling. His fingers found the side of her face. Just his hand, just her face, the cold of his skin against hers, and he stayed there. Not pulling. Not pushing. Just his hand against her face like a question he'd finally decided to ask out loud. Her eyes closed for 1 second. Just one. Just the warmth of it. Zoe, he said. The way he'd said it in the library. Except this time he didn't walk away. She opened her eyes. He was watching her with an expression she'd never seen on him before. Unguarded, fully, nothing held back. No composure. No careful stillness. Just him as he actually was, which was not cold and not ruthless and not the word the laundresses used. He was a man who stood outside his daughter's door at night and didn't go in because he was afraid of doing it wrong. He was a man who had learned to make himself small inside a very large life. She put her hand over his. The one on her face. He let out a breath. Long and slow like he'd been holding it for 7 years. I'm not going anywhere, she said quietly. Not in 30 days. Not in 30 years. She meant it the way she'd meant dock my wages. Simple, factual, the math already done. But you have to decide what that means. What you're willing to say it is. He looked at her for a moment. Then he leaned his forehead down against hers. Fully. Both hands now framing her face and her hands over his and the cold all around them and his forehead against hers. Just that. Just the contact. Just the warmth of him finally not standing near the door. I know what it is, he said. Against her forehead, quiet as something only meant for the two of them, which it was. I knew what it was when you told me you'd be here in 31 days. She laughed. Quietly. The laugh that comes when something that's been knotted loosens all at once. He pulled back just far enough to look at her. His thumbs moved, barely, just a small motion against her face, and his eyes were the eyes she'd catalogued 17 days ago as the thing he couldn't control, and what was in them now she did not have a word for, but she didn't need one. Come inside, he said. You're cold. So are you. I have a crown to reclaim, he said, looking at the stone ledge. It'll keep. She didn't move. He looked at her. Something crossed his face. Warm, quiet, the rarest kind of expression on a man who had spent 7 years keeping his face empty. It looked like relief. It looked like arriving somewhere after a very long road. Yes, he said softly. It will. 3 years later, the lower library still smelled like dust and old candle wax. Elara was 11 now and far too sophisticated, she said, for being read to, and then she curled up on the window seat every evening anyway and listened. She'd grown 2 inches and lost 2 teeth and gained an opinion about border policy that she had delivered at dinner twice, both times to her father's barely concealed delight. The court had adjusted. Courts always did. Vesa had told Zoe that herself in the corridor after the feast, in the tone of a woman delivering an assessment. You held your ground. That matters more than bloodlines in the long run. It hadn't been a warm speech. It had been true, which was better. Lord Aldrich had taken the offered concession regarding his son's placement and gone home. Fenwick had, over the course of a year, stopped looking pained every time he saw her and started occasionally asking her opinion on things, which she gave whether he asked or not. And Caelan, who was still not easy, who still stood near doors sometimes and sometimes forgot to say things out loud that he meant for people to know, had learned one thing. He sat down now. In the library. Every evening that the council allowed it. He read his documents in the chair closest to the window seat, and Elara read beside him, and Zoe read on the floor with her back against his chair, and the fire burned and the dust settled and nobody was performing anything for anyone. Some nights he fell asleep in the chair. On those nights Elara would look at Zoe across the sleeping king with an expression that had layers in it. Love and old grief and something that was purely, simply glad. Zoe would pull the blanket from the window seat and put it over him. Carefully. Two-handed and careful. The way he'd once done for his daughter. The way you do for someone you're not afraid of loving wrong. That's the story. All of it. I hope it held you. If you felt something, that's the point. That's always the point. Tell me in the comments, what was your favorite moment? Share this with someone who needs a good story tonight. And if you're not subscribed to Naomi's Feral Stories yet, you just read 5 acts. You know what we do here. Come back. There's always another one waiting.